Welcome back to Seek Strength and welcome back to Seekistan. Now, you might be wondering why I've got a black eye.
So this week we just got news of Rhys Webb, former Welsh international rugby player, getting some adverse analytical findings or some variabilities on his drug test from the French anti-doping lab. He hasn't been sentenced yet, or he hasn't gotten any bans yet. He hasn't even been charged with any anti-doping allegations. But what it seems to be is there is some discrepancy in his growth hormone levels. So we're going to talk a small bit about that today. We're then going to talk a small bit about anti-doping or doping violations generally in rugby. I think that should cue us up nicely for the coverage we'll have of the Rugby World Cup over the next few months.
Rhys is a former international rugby player for Wales. He just retired this year. He was playing on the Six Nations team last year, I believe.
Yeah.
Warren Gatlin is currently coaching the Welsh rugby team, and it is right on the cusp of the World Cup. So it's quite an interesting time for a reasonably high-profile player to be testing positive.
Yeah, so the interesting thing here is more so the kind of testing protocols that are being done, the lab that's doing it. So it's LAFD, which is Laboratoire Antidopage Français, which is the WADA lab in Paris, which most of you will know it as.
Boo!
Losers. So basically they've ramped up their testing efforts massively in rugby union over the last 2 years as we lead into the Rugby World Cup in Paris, in France. So it makes sense. I think the agreement was made with them about 2.5 or 3 years ago. So the reported numbers so far is that there's just over 2,500 tests been done on rugby players from 60 different nations over the last 2 years since that partnership was drawn up. Now we look at the actual positive findings of doping in rugby over the last few years, but interestingly, this new growth hormone test, or the growth hormone test they have at the moment, which is the one that's being called into question here, has some question marks around it as a test itself.
Well, as someone who has been inside a lab,
Nerd.
I'd question it.
Is that where you got the black eye?
Yeah, they beat me
We're
up.
getting bullied.
So growth hormone is a pretty interesting one, and a lot of you might have remembered some of the very, very rare cases that appeared over the years of someone testing positive for growth hormone. Most noticeably in the weightlifting scene was Pat Mendes, who was essentially caught because they extended their detection time just a little bit by, I think, about a day extra, which was originally like 24 hours, and they pushed it to close to 48 hours, and he tested positive in competition for that. But outside of that, there was very few actual positive cases for growth hormone. One of the most notable ones was a former rugby player, and he didn't actually test positive. He was just snitched on, which is a disgrace. Snitching
It's
on
actually
someone.
disgusting, isn't it?
So there's a couple of different methods by which they use to test for growth hormone. The problem with this is it's quite similar to erythropoietin or EPO, like we talked about the other week, is that testing directly for growth hormone is quite different or quite difficult. So when we test for stuff like anabolic steroids, diuretics, SARMs, any of that good stuff, it's very easy to actually detect the waste products or the metabolites from those drugs. Someone takes a drug, Dara for example, would take a drug, I'd steal his piss, put it into my magic machine, and then I'd get a certain number of peaks from that machine, or things you can call fingerprints, or particular patterns from that machine that would show me that Dara has taken these particular drugs, his body has metabolized them and given off these very, very distinct chemical forms of this drug or byproducts of this drug. The reason we can say this confidently is because there's no way Dara would naturally have winstrol in his blood, and so the byproduct.
You haven't seen my blood, Owen.
the reason then we see those byproducts in his blood lets us know that Dara, knowingly or unknowingly, clearly knowingly, took performance-enhancing drugs. Now, the problem with things like growth hormone, EPO, IGF-1, peptides, growth hormone releasing peptides, or growth hormone releasing hormones, is that they are essentially bioidentical. So there's kind of two forms people take growth hormone in. It is the recombinant version, so that is the man-made synthesized version, and this looks identical to one particular version of growth hormone that appears in the human body. The other one is cadaver growth hormone, which is entirely identical to the growth hormone that appears in the human body in all its forms and essentially is undetectable.
That's the good shit.
Cadaver growth hormone is very unlikely to be used at all, if ever, anymore. But when it comes to the recombinant. So recombinant is generally a man-made version, is what it refers to. Growth hormone, there's a couple of issues with it. It's the fact that it looks identical to what's known as the isoform, or one of the main isoforms of growth hormone. So this is what's known as the 22 kilodalton isoform of growth hormone. This makes up the vast majority of the growth hormone circulating in your blood. And the problem with detecting this is that growth hormone, if we were to test just for growth hormone levels or IGF-1 levels, is that it fluctuates massively during the day. Exogenous growth hormone primarily looks like the endogenous growth hormone, the growth hormone that comes from your pituitary gland. So there's a couple of different methods they use. One is known as the isoform test, which is essentially you look at the ratio of the 22 kilodalton one, which is the one we know that is made recombinantly or man-made, and generally it's about 70% of the growth hormone in your blood. And if it exceeds this value, we know that if you take growth hormone, you temporarily stop the production of your own growth hormone. And so if you have an entirely 22 kilodalton growth hormone circulating in your blood, you can say with reasonable certainty that the athlete has taken exogenous growth hormone. This, however, we're talking hours or less in terms of how long it takes from these levels to return to normal. So it's a very, very difficult, very, very time-sensitive form of testing and anti-doping to be done on an athlete.
Yeah, the test they have at the moment is kind of a combination of a number of things. So Owen's talking about those levels fluctuating throughout the day. There's also big fluctuations between age groups, genders, what sport you're playing, your general physique, how much muscle mass you're holding. There's a massive amount of factors that kind of lead into it, which leads to the GH2000 scoring method, which GH2000 sounds amazing.
Well, there's also the GH2004 marker method.
The interesting thing about it is that it's going to catch some of the people who are using things that are referred to as GH secretagogues, some of those peptides that are very, very prevalent on the market at the moment, some of the SERMs, MK677 and things along those lines. In the press release, or in some of the press release, they've referred to a very slight fluctuation or a very slight deviation from the score. So I assume that he's just barely out of line.
So we actually have a study done in 2021, which is fairly recent. Anti-doping science moves pretty reasonably fast. Every year there could be like literally a revolutionary new method. Remember in weightlifting, the metabolites of turinabol and sinazolol increased from, one of them went from 9 months, but the other went from like 4 days to 7.5 days or something. And they caught like
everybody got caught.
25 weightlifters. So there really can be huge leaps, and there's the athlete biological passport, which a lot of you've probably heard of. And if any of you have been drug tested at this stage, it's possible you have a biological passport on record. And basically what they did was, a lot of times when you submit a drug testing sample, you can agree that the sample is kept for research, but you won't be implicated in any of the results for that research. I always take to know, obviously, because fuck what, no, I'm joking.
You're not joking about that.
I'm not joking, no. There is, you can tick yes, and there's literally no reason not to do it at the time. But basically it looks at the athlete's biological passport. They take this elite athlete data because it's very, very useful for them, and they can then do this new test on it. Now, they won't be able to get any individual from that, but they will then be able to update their suspicions, of which I'm sure they have many. Basically, they looked at insulin-like growth factor, procollagen 3 peptide, or P3NP. These are associated with taking growth hormone in sport. Looked at these in these athletes' biological passport, or these samples, and then they compared them to a once-off administration, single-site, placebo-controlled study. So they just literally, someone got 1 dose of growth hormone and probably had a great night's sleep that night, and that was it. Basically carried out, assigned to multiple different groups. Basically, it's pretty accurate.
Yeah, really?
So the athlete biological based approach set 99% specificity as being like the minimum threshold for catching it. They got 20 of the 27 people in the group receiving the HGH treatment, including 17 of 27 individuals after cessation of treatment, which is quite interesting for growth hormone. Sensitivity ranged from 12.5 to 71.4 across the HGH concentrations tested following 7 days after treatment. peaking at 57 to 100% after 21 days of treatment. And this maintained at 37 to 71 for the low and high dose groups 1 week after cessation of treatment. So,
yeah, it is pretty accurate.
yeah.
I think if we look at this as a whole, so obviously Rhys Webb in this case is a non-international player, or a pretty big name, a former international player. It's a great scalp to get. Importantly, he's non-French and he's not competing in this World Cup.
Isn't it?
If you're looking at it with your tinfoil hat on.
Which you probably should be. When it comes
Yeah.
to doping and major sporting organisations, the first thing you should do is put on your tinfoil hat and go, what's probably happening here? Obviously, in a lot of cases, people are caught because the anti-dopers probably want to catch them. But when it comes to something like rugby, which is something that makes its own bread, butters its own bread, toasts its own bread,
Makes its own gravy,
puts it on the bread, it's so not in international rugby, but either in union or otherwise, to catch any player.
Yeah, so if there's two different places you can go to see positive tests in rugby. The first of those is the WADA kind of report each year, and then you have World Rugby's report each year. WADA's reports are only out until 2021. Obviously, there's ongoing cases from last year. So in 2021, 4,415 drug tests carried out in the sport of rugby union across both 15s and 7s. From those nearly 4,500, there was 25 adverse analytical findings.
Fuck.
Now, only between 5 and 10 of those cases ended up in a ban. I think the more interesting thing besides that is when we look at World Rugby and we look at the bans that came out last year, there's 4 players banned. So those 4 players...
Yeah.
Like, this is pretty horrendous, because when you look at players who are banned by World Rugby, none of them are from rugby countries. So last year we had 2 Namibian young players on their under 20s team, and we had 2 Chilean late or early 20s players were banned. The Namibians one of them was taking a diuretic. I'm not sure quite why. The other one was taking Deca. The Chileans, one was taking Clomid, one was taking Anaver. You can figure that out for yourself. Interestingly, the Namibians were tested while on tour in Canada by the Canadians.
This is the equivalent of Finnish people testing positive in the World Baseball Series for America.
Because it doesn't matter. And that's when we look at the findings from the year before. You get a Russian player, 5 Romanian players, and then a lot from South America and from Africa.
They like the 7s in Romania, I think.
Yeah.
Put a bit of work into it. Like.
So it's difficult. Like, big rugby countries understand when they're getting tested. Obviously, in the lead up to the World Cup, they know they're going to get tested. Those players are quite clean. We get asked on a probably weekly basis at this point, or multiple times per week, is there doping in rugby? There's doping in every sport. But rugby is definitely a sport where drugs help a lot.
So, yeah, it does come up anytime we talk about rugby. Someone will be like, do you think they're on gear? And it's like, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's probably a very jacked duck, is basically how you should look through things like this, especially in rugby. I remember reading an article years ago. It was from a former Irish rugby player, and he felt like that there was going to be a huge scandal in rugby eventually for doping. I just don't think there ever will be, to be honest. There's no interest, there's no reason for any individual country to test any of their major players positive. It doesn't make sense. This particular player, Rhys, is former international. He's playing a club rugby scene. He's not from he wasn't on the Welsh squad. I bet if he'd still been on the Welsh squad, this wouldn't have come to light, if I had to make a guess.
No, there certainly wouldn't be a press release. Like, the fact that he hasn't been charged, and there's already been a press release or at the club. So the club basically suspend the players playing in Biarritz. Once you have a letter from that LAFD, once you have that, or LADF,
stick the letter, putting it in the bin.
Once you have that letter, you're just suspended. But there's no charges. There's the case is ongoing. He's going for a meeting, or he has been for a meeting the Monday of this week. So it's an ongoing case. But obviously, doping in French rugby has been well documented over the years. Obviously, there's a big expose around 4 years ago where a medical clinic was directly linked with a certain French a French First League team. You can read into that on your own. Like, doping definitely exists in rugby. doping in rugby is very different from doping in the Olympics or in one of these sports where it's countries directly competing against each other and it's an international federation testing them. Most testing will take place in country or within a club or within a national team setup. So it is very, very different. It's a completely different level of control. But I thought it was interesting this case popped up this week.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of doping in rugby, both from, I think you could look at rugby players and make the assumption, but also from knowing a lot of rugby players. It goes to essentially the grassroots level. It's a very competitive sport in a lot of countries. Schools rugby, particularly in that late teenage years, SARMs are currently something that is very popular with them. It's very, very frequently used, unfortunately, and I think it's a very sad state of affairs for teenagers to need to be using anything, given the long-term consequences that they can't really make a good decision on. I think SARMs, the availability of SARMs and them being not illegal technically in a lot of countries makes it very easy for acquiring SARMs. And if you look at the studies of labs which test SARMs, we talked about this last week, over half of the SARMs tested contain SARMs or some other ingredients. So a lot of times they're actually getting SARMs and they order them online. Not to pigeonhole SARMs, but it is something that is quite frequent. You see a lot of kind of 16 to 18 year olds, generally because they're on the cusp of hopefully either going from a schools rugby team or a local club team to some kind of provincial team or semi-pro or maybe even pro, obviously for a smaller percentage of those. And the difference it makes going from 80 kilos at 6'2" to 100 kilos at 6'2" over the course of an off season could literally make or break your career. And if you're going playing in the leagues in France, for example, you're looking to make an astronomical amount of money playing rugby, more so than you would for most countries. And it is something that is financially very viable if you're able to make it and play enough seasons in those countries. And it's something a lot of people who watch rugby will be aware of. There's a lot of controversy, like for players like Ireland.
Funnily enough, in this case, that's why Rhys Webb retired.
Yes.
100 days before the World Cup, because he couldn't financially make it viable to play in Wales.
Is it Ronan O'Gara's getting paid something like over $1 million?
I have no idea.
He
deserves every cent of it.
Who's he coaching?
La Rochelle.
La Rochelle, yeah. He's coaching them. And the players get a lot, like hundreds of thousands, which is rugby is very good money. Once again, just to talk on that thing where people always immediately compare it to NBA or soccer, for the vast majority of sports, if you're earning the hundreds of thousands for playing your sport, you're having a great time. So it is, it's a no-brainer really to take something that will make you better at your job. It's like being a chef and not using most of your knives. It's like throwing out
or a tasting spoon.
It's like, it's not even like a tasting spoon. It's like, will I use a non-stick frying pan or will I go outside and cook on a stone with no fire or something? It's, make no mistake. That's rugby do be doing it. They be at it.
Thanks very much for watching the video. If you're a rugby player and you're looking for an in-season training program, we have the Seek a Strength in-season rugby program. It's 2 sessions per week. Both of them are quite time efficient. So you're out of the gym in kind of an hour and 10 or an hour and 20 minutes. This will allow you to train, if you have a game on Saturday, it will allow you to train in the gym Monday and Wednesday evening or Tuesday and Thursday evening. Still maintain those gains while increasing some of those power and speed and strength numbers. It's a very efficient program. It's available at the link below. If you have any questions, seekastrength@gmail.com.
Work a whole lot better if you're taking growth hormone, though.